I wasn't prepared for what I heard. Not that I ever was when it came to B. This material was extraordinary, unlike anything I'd ever heard or read on the subject, and as it unfolded, I began to see the point of the story of the Imperial Chill. B was bringing to light crucial facts as far beyond argument as the Emperor's nakedness, or so I naively imagined. When he was finished, about 7 people applauded, 2 of them being our hosts, and 3 of them being Sheeran, Michael, and me. Looking drained to the point of collapse, B began fielding questions, or rather disquisitions and rebuttals, all in German. Michael leaned in my direction to explain that by declining to use English, which they obviously understood, they were demonstrating their contempt for B's views. Before answering them, B summarized their questions in English, presumably for my benefit. As far as I could understand them, they simply denied everything B had said. An interesting approach, I thought. At the end of it, or when he got tired of it, he concluded with a little epilogue to the Imperial Chill, which he directed to me. When the scholars in the capital of the Chile Emperor had had a few days to think things over, they began to recover their wits and to see that all was not lost to them after all. They called a press conference that was twice as solemn as the Prime Minister's and 3 times as well attended. After the various media representatives had been wined and dined regally, the head of the Royal Commission for Chile Research called the meeting to order and made the following announcement. "It's perfectly true that the Emperor is naked," he said. "We have always known this and have always chosen to ignore it because it's a red herring. The causes of the Emperor's condition are many, complex, and difficult for laymen to understand, and they cannot be reduced to this single childish notion, that he is cold because he's wearing nothing but his birthday suit. The suggestion that warm clothing might alleviate the Emperor's discomfort is charming and well meant, but will not be recommended for implementation or further study." Following this announcement, the Prime Minister was dismissed for incompetence, the scholars' grants were all renewed, and the Emperor went on shivering into a snowy old age. B thanked his listeners and stepped away in the midst of a bemused silence. Evidently some sort of polite social follow-up had been planned for us, but we skipped it in order to catch a train back to Hamburg. As luck would have it, this late-night train was of the cozy, old-fashioned sort, with separate compartments. Between Stuttgart and Frankfurt. "Remind me never to do this again," B said once we were settled in. "I reminded you before you agreed to go in the first place," Sheeran noted dryly. "You didn't do it forcefully enough." Michael cleared his throat and said, "You never know when you might have planted a seed, and then turn an amazing shade of scarlet." "It's kind of you to say that, Michael," B said gently, "but that was mighty hard ground." It was indeed. "Where did we leave off last night?" B asked me a few minutes later. I thought for a bit and said, "You just made this point, that what the authors of the story of the fall saw in our agricultural revolution was not a new technology, but a new worldview that makes us out to be as wise as the gods, wise enough to wield the power of life and death over the world." B nodded. "I'm glad we got that far, but that's the easy part of what we have to accomplish." "Why is that?" "It's easy enough to imagine what was going on when the universe was born, because we see the universe every time we lift our eyes to the sky. But it's very, very difficult to imagine what was going on before the universe was born." "Nothing was going on before the universe was born, by definition." "Precisely." I shook my head. "You'll have to relate this to our subject here. It's not easy for us to understand what those first farmers had in mind when they settled down to live in villages. It's easy for us to understand what Bronze Age traders had in mind as they caravanned their wares over hundreds of miles between Thebes and Heracleopolis, and Damascus and Assur and Ur. It's easy for us to understand what the empire builders of Akkad and Sumer had in mind, what the builders of the Great Wall of China had in mind, what the builders of the colossal pyramids of Egypt had in mind. I trust you see what I mean. I could obviously go on piling up examples for hours." "I see what you mean. We understand what they had in mind because they were doing what we would do in their place. They were our cultural kin. These were people who saw the world as we see it, and who saw man's place in the world as we see it." "I understand. But when we look back beyond our agricultural revolution into the human past, we no longer understand what people had in mind. We don't understand what they had in mind as they lived through tens of thousands of years without trade and commerce, without empires or kingdoms or even villages, without accomplishments of any kind. That's very true. I'd say it's our impression that they didn't have anything in mind. It's not that we don't understand it, it's that there was nothing there to be understood. This is the parallelism to the birth of the universe, Jared. We can't understand what was going on before the birth of the universe because nothing was going on. And we can't understand what people had in mind before the birth of our culture because we imagine that they had nothing in mind. That's the way it seems, yes. This is, of course, another result of the Great Forgetting. We've forgotten what people had in mind before our revolution. I said, I guess I still don't get it. Why is it important to know what people had in mind before our agricultural revolution? B sighed. There are some teaching problems that can only be solved by parables, and I guess this is one of them. Let me think for a minute. I looked around at the others, but they were both keeping their eyes and their thoughts to themselves. We were at this moment just pulling into Frankfurt. B and I were sitting from across each other at the window side of the car, and with nothing better to do, I scanned the faces of passengers waiting to board, and was surprised to see a familiar one. The train had glided past him by the time I remembered who it was. It was Herr Reichmann, the elderly gentleman who had advised me to drop Charles Adderley in favor of the person scheduled to speak at Der Bow, who of course turned out to be B. I was thinking vaguely of the possibility of introducing B and Herr Reichmann to each other when B began his tale. The Weavers. It's well known, B said, that every piece of hand-woven cloth has an element of magic in it, which is the special magic of its weaver. This magic doesn't necessarily die with the individual weaver, but rather can be passed on from generation to generation and shared among families and even whole nations, so that one who is sensitive to such things can tell in a moment whether a piece of cloth was woven in Ireland or France or Virginia or Bavaria. This is true on every planet in the universe where weaving is practiced, and it was true on the planet I'd like to tell you about right now. It happened on this planet that a weaver named Nixt came along who was a strange compound of genius and insanity, violence and artistry, ruthlessness and charm. And this was the magic he wove into his cloth, and those who wore garments made from it became just like the weaver. The weaver was quickly renowned, and everyone wanted clothes imbued with his magic. Wearing such clothes, artists created masterpieces, merchants got rich, leaders extended their power, soldiers triumphed in battle, and lovers left their rivals in the dust. Almost immediately it was noticed that Nixtian magic had some drawbacks. It was so powerful that it tended to devour what it touched. Instead of lasting for centuries, artists' masterpieces tended to disintegrate after only decades. Instead of lasting for generations, merchants' riches tended to melt away in a single lifetime. Instead of lasting for decades, leaders' power tended to ebb away in years. Instead of lasting for years, lovers' charms tend to pall in months. No one cared. Artists wanted masterpieces, merchants wanted money, leaders wanted power, and lovers wanted conquests. Naturally, every weaver in the land wanted to weave with Nixtian magic, and Nixt himself was soon so extravagantly wealthy that he was glad to share it with them. Within a generation, every single weaver in the realm was practicing only this one kind of magic, and all others had been forgotten. From swaddling clothes to shrouds, everyone in the land wore clothes with Nixtian magic, and as you can easily imagine, this nation almost overnight became preeminent among the nations of the world. There wasn't a thing to stop them from taking over the entire planet, and they proceeded to do so in just a few generations. And in every land they conquered, weavers who were practicing other kinds of magic either learned Nixtian magic or they took up some other occupation. The spread of Nixtian magic revealed another of its drawbacks. Its exhaustive qualities seemed to increase exponentially. When twice as many masterpieces were created with Nixtian magic, they disintegrated 4 times as fast. When 3 times as many merchants were getting rich with Nixtian magic, their money melted away 9 times as fast. No one liked it, of course, but artists still wanted masterpieces, merchants still wanted wealth, leaders still wanted power, and so on. Within 1,000 years, every weaver on the planet knew only one kind of magic, and all others had been forgotten. Within another 1,000 years, it was forgotten that any other kind of magic had ever been practiced in weaving, and people soon ceased to think of it as magic at all. It was just part of the process of weaving, and for all they knew, this had always been the case. In other words, they experienced a great forgetting of their own. They eventually came to view Nixtian magic as just part of weaving, just the way people of our culture eventually came to view totalitarian agriculture as just part of being human. The trouble was that once every man, woman, and child on the planet was wearing clothes woven with Nixtian magic, the exhaustive power of this magic was operating at such a high level that masterpieces were only lasting weeks, and no one wanted them. Fortunes were made and routinely lost within days, and merchants lived in a state of suicidal depression. Governments and whole political systems came and went like seasons of the year, and no one even bothered to learn the names of presidents or prime ministers. Romances and love affairs seldom lasted for more than 2 or 3 hours. It was at this point of total systemic burnout that some enterprising paleoanthropologists happened quite fortuitously to discover that weaving had existed long before the time of Nixt, and that people had for hundreds of thousands of years been very happy to wear clothes woven with other kinds of magic. And amazingly enough, even without Nixtian magic, artists had still occasionally produced masterpieces, merchants had gotten rich, leaders had become powerful, and lovers had made conquests. And more important, these achievements had, by modern standards, been durable to an almost unthinkable degree. Terrifically excited, these paleoanthropologists brought their discovery to the attention of their department head and asked to be released from other duties so they could study ancient weavings and possibly even rediscover the magic employed in their production. I guess I don't get it, the department head said after patiently listening to the proposals. Why is it important to know what weavers were doing before the age of Nixt? Now the parable is this. I assume you see the parallels to what we've been talking about, B said. I believe your words were, why is it important to know what people had in mind before our agricultural revolution? Do you still need an answer to that question? I wish I could say no, I told him, but I honestly can't. Here's my problem. I can see what motivated us because I can see what we accomplished. But I can't see what idea motivated our ancestors because I can't see what they accomplished. As far as I can see, they didn't accomplish anything. Show me what they accomplished, then maybe I can believe there was an idea motivating them. What did the pre-Nixtian weavers in my parable accomplish? You mean between the time their race came into being and the era of Nixt? That's right, B said. I guess they learned how to weave. Exactly, and not an inconsiderable accomplishment, surely. Our ancestors accomplished something similar in the first 3 million years of human life. They learned how to live like humans, how to live well, how to have a great life. They developed a lifestyle that was uniquely human, entirely different from all other primate lifestyles, a lifestyle for creatures capable of poetry, philosophy, music, dance, mythology, art, and invention on a wide technological front. And is there an idea behind that? I think you'll find there is. In any case, that's the challenge that confronts me, Jared, to reveal to you this idea. Right now, I know it seems to you that all this beauty and catastrophe of ours was bound to happen. It was somehow in the very fabric of humanity to become what we've become, in the way that it's in the very fabric of the caterpillar to become the butterfly. Yes, that is the way it seems to me. Someday, if I succeed, you'll see that humanity was no more bound to become us than it was bound to become Gabusi. The people of our culture don't represent the final stage of human development any more than the Gabusi do. I hope you do succeed in that, I said. I really do. He stood up, grabbed the luggage rack overhead to steady himself. Time for a walk, he said, and headed for the door. I sat up and looked at Michael and Sheeran for a while, inviting conversation. Since that wasn't forthcoming, I pulled up my notebook and brought it up to date.